Hi, welcome to another BAPT in Conversation webinar. It's the British Association for Psychological Type. I'm Richard Owen, one of the trustees. BAPT is a charitable organisation. We promote knowledge of psychological type. We will organise events and an annual conference. Next one's coming up in April 2023. It's another online conference, so look out for that. You can see more on bapt.org.uk. So today, it's a pleasure to have back again, for the second time, Dario Nardi, who's a neuroscience researcher, type expert, and it's great to have him back. Hi, how are you doing, Dario?
Oh, absolutely. It's great to be back. Thank you.
So you're in Norway currently, is that correct?
Yes. It's the weather is perhaps slightly better at times than Britain, but a little bit colder darker when it comes to winter.
Yeah, darkness for sure this time of year. And your work there, I was just interested what you said before, what you're doing, this interactive training involving type, is that correct?
Yes, there is an element of type for sure. So what we're doing now is so I work with this client called Safer, SAYFR, and they're based in Norway, but the worldwide clients. And so we build interactive training scenarios, and those are essentially imagine watching a series of TV episodes on like some interesting show where there's different characters of different types, and they're facing some mysteries, some technical challenges, and also the interpersonal drama, and then take that and make it interactive so that you are following along and you have choices to make and the mysteries to solve. And the idea is that people learn much better. The brain remembers much better when people are in an immersive environment and when they're making choices. Yeah.
Really fascinating. And what sort of results do you get from this kind of training?
Well, one thing is, well, we focus on particular leadership skills that we hope people will be building: openness, care, teamwork, giving feedback, listening, learning how to speak up. And there is a before, during, and after process of evaluating for personnel, how are they doing in these different dimensions. So for example, many maritime companies, that's mostly what we work with, they have international crews, and in many cultures, speaking up against an authority figure is considered inappropriate. So even when the person sees something that's terribly wrong, like the captain is drunk, for example, they're not going to say anything. So we do various forms of feedback and assessment. I don't do that part, other people do, but type is a part of it, the information we gather. And we see that after people go through this process, that their capacity to speak up, their trust in fellow team members, their ability to be open about vulnerabilities, these things increase. And most importantly, it's not self-report, is that the accident rate and insurance rates for these companies go down. So we're talking about a 50 to 75% reduction in accidents. And in something where you're dealing with heavy machinery or whatnot, that's actually millions of dollars that save. So they're very much your bottom line results. And type is a part of this process. So that through the 8 episodes we happen to be building with one company right now, actually we're delivering at this moment, that all 16 types are represented. And I think this is particularly important because the modal type there is, I think, ESTJ or ISTJ. There's a lot of ST folks, but all types are present. There are also NT and SF and a few NFs. And the idea is to really give them exposure to all the different personalities, in addition to other leadership tools and ways of thinking about things.
It's wonderful to hear about type-inspired knowledge saving lives in the real world. It's a fantastic thing. part of the stereotypist in me wonders what type the drunk captain is, but don't need to get into that. I'm interested though in what kind of which sort of types, if there's any information about this, are likely to not report the captain. Is there any?
Well, a lot of that is really, I mean, so there are different layers. There's a cultural layer that we pay attention to. There's a gender layer that's also present, and type is one layer. One thing that sort of emerged naturally in creating these trainings is that often there would be a dynamic between two of the other characters who are of opposite types. So for example, in one scenario, you have an ENTP, sort of hotshot supervisor, who is known for improving efficiency and bringing in innovative ways of bringing the efficiency. So he's known for innovation, and he runs up against another character who's part of his team, who has more experience, more years of experience. Also, she is from a different culture, and she has ISFJ preferences. And so we see this dynamic between them, and that's giving a good example of how it is that personality differences. And in part of creating the characters is actually interviewing people of those types and getting a sense if you were in this situation, how would you respond? And yeah, of course, there are some types of individuals who are less likely to speak up or maybe delay speaking up. And that's but for various reasons. Someone with ISTJ preferences is out of a feeling of loyalty that they're not going to speak up. Whereas someone who is, say, ISTP might be, well, we'll just let the person bury himself in his mistakes, and then we'll pick up the pieces afterwards, because in his cynical experience, saying something which he has before didn't produce any result. So there's different loyalty, cynicism, not wanting to rock the boat, afraid that sticking their neck out is going to invite negative feedback on themselves. So different types have different reasons for not speaking up. And we really show examples. We try and show examples of all of those.
I love that. It's fascinating to think of the different reasons, motivations for the same kind of behaviors.
Yeah, and that gets at something that's very important about type, that type is not a trait model, that it's not about the sorting different behaviors. Although clearly there are typical behaviors, especially for people from a certain era, that will tend to correlate with particular types. But really, going back to it, Jung described 8 forms of consciousness. And we can't really define what consciousness is. So I mean, you can ask anybody in anywhere, hotshot university neuroscientist, which is not me, can give some answer, and could be like an award winner like Roger Penrose, and we still don't know. It becomes very controversial. We have no answers. So it's really the people's experience, how they direct their consciousness. And that's sort of and I believe that's why type has the magic that it does, it is really trying to get at something that's a little bit ineffable, and special about the human experience, whereas anybody can measure behavior. That's we can watch films of people interacting and count the number of times that they do certain things, or whatever it is. You use self-assessments.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's grounding. It's a dynamic model of psychological processes, right? As a model of personality, we can't forget that. I'm interested in we've been talking about your day job, I guess, haven't we, here for so far? And I mean, besides that, you're well known for presenting at conferences as an author of many books now, including The Magic Diamond, which we should plug as a recent publication. How's the response been going to that so far since you published it?
It is really good. Is gotten out there and gotten a lot of interest from people. I do think, though, it's the kind of book which is sort of, it doesn't present just, although it presents one idea, the magic diamond, one just sort of, we sort of need to explain that. And most of the book is about application. And my original purpose was to create 8 packets, and each packet is for a particular, cognitive process or Jungian function. And then it really comes down to what are we going to do with that. So I've been working with Personality Hacker, which is based in the United States, Antonia Dodge and Joel Witt, and offering workshops for people. And, it's come up in podcasts and so on as well. And allowing people the time to really engage the material. Because it turns out that, yes, I mean, people, text me or, email and say, yes, this has been very interesting and getting into it. But the end thing is that it's application. And so, for example, in putting together a 3-week program where we meet 3 times over the 3 weeks, that allows people that 1 week to digest what is in it. It's weird in a way that people will expect that, oh yes, in order to learn about business, for example, or history or something like that, they're going to go get a degree. But if they want to learn about themselves, they should be able to do that in 5 minutes. Or they should be able to read 1 book, and that the act of reading the book will change their life. And I'm like, no, we need to do the hard work around it. So the book is really there for, has all these examples of things we can do to bring opposites together. And they're just examples. The person has to, of course, springboard off of that into their own life. Personally, what I felt was most valuable for me in working on it was going back and reading through Psychological Types again, Jung's work, and really condensing down what he said about each function in just a few pages to really get at the heart of it. And, Jung does not paint this happy picture like Isabel Myers did. He spends like 80-90% of each function talking about how it goes wrong, either mildly wrong or horribly wrong. And that's something that I think sometimes people forget. I'm not saying that we should dwell on those, but that's so I would like to say I've been doing more with it, but I actually have not been doing a lot of workshops. My time has really been focused on some other projects, including this, the 4 subtypes. Yeah. And that's and finding ways to get that out and to people and talk about it. And because that really comes, I believe, from there's an organic need out there in the world. It's something people have been talking about, flavors of type, sort of informally for decades, and then addressing that by bringing in the neuroscience. And there's actually several different routes to it. I mean, other people have also been working on subtypes. Even some like Dr. Helen Fisher, her work turns out to be extremely relevant, even though she doesn't use type at all, but it's quite relevant. And then Dr. Victor Galenko, who's coming from the Eastern European interpretation of Jung's work, socionics, and he really notices there were similarities and differences, for example, in how ISFP is described one way and socionics in quite a different way in the Myers-Briggs tradition, especially the David Kiersey tradition of 16 types. And he's like, the only reason they're different is because they're emphasizing different subtypes. And the Western tradition emphasizes the creative ISFP, who's rebellious and creative, and this and that, and is sort of dopamine driven. And he's like, the socionics tradition emphasizes this normalizing version of ISFP that's much more serotonin driven. If you bring in Dr. Helen Fisher's work, and then that makes the person look quite different. And yet, I mean, there are many ISFPs who are not the wild creative types. And then they wonder, why do I not exactly fit here? Or this, like, wow, the world has such a heroic view of me. I don't feel this way. And yet functionally, they fit the definition of ISFP. So it's really about, the Subtypes project is really about creating room for all the different variations of type. And when people have asked, like, it's the 21st century, 16 types is great, but can't we do more? There's sort of this understanding that, like, we can manage complexity. why can't we manage 32 types or 64 types or 512 or whatever it is? I think 512 is a little bit to hold in people's head. But 64, if we take the 16 types we know, and then just add one more sort of rubric or layer that's 4, as we say in Norway, krosset, that we can really, we can help people better get to best fit type. We can help them, I think, particularly with career coaching. And then, other stuff as well, for people who feel like, why don't I meet the definition? So it's very interesting in Europe, for example, continental Europe, I meet ESFPs who say that they feel the descriptions of ESFP and type materials are very American. And they're like, yeah, I identify as ESFP, but there are parts of it, like the entertaining ESFP is like, that doesn't fit. Not like it doesn't fit technically, but flavor-wise, there's something off. And I think, and as I discovered through my neuroscience research, just looking at the brain wiring, that this notion of like a Western mind, that somehow we can take Europeans and Brits and Americans and Australians and throw them all into the pot and they all sort of think the same way, is actually really quite wrong. And really takes us down the wrong path. So I think we can also open it up and make it more egalitarian and more fitting to people around the world by looking at subtypes.
Okay, it's really interesting what you're doing there, taking these differences in normalize ways that people normalize a certain type as almost a stereotype, and then how that might differ culturally. I just want to kind of set the scene for this before we dive even further into the subtypes, is that kind of, like you said, it's based on your neuroscience research.
I'm afraid I completely lost you there.
Okay, I hope it's not my in the recording. So I'll go back again. So just setting the scene really for going further into the subtypes. You're saying it's based in your EEG neuroscience work. I know you kind of refer to yourself as a neuroscience researcher rather than a neuroscientist, and there's maybe some difference to that with you being rather than being currently based in a university or whatever in academia, you're more of an independent researcher. How do you see that position for you? What's the difference between what you're doing and how people work in academia per se?
Well, I did start my work in academia, and I was there for 17 years, so I'm pretty familiar with it. I would say that primarily in academia, the focus is on publishing and working in trying to answer extremely narrow questions. Narrow doesn't mean tiny questions, like so you could really define something very precisely that is a very broad kind of issue. But there are a lot of constraints in academia, and I think we need to be careful to not fetishize academia as somehow that's the only way to do things. I mean, we know that the commercial world, for example, academia did not produce the personal computer revolution. I mean, I remember a world before personal computers, not just before smartphones, but before, desktop PCs. It was the commercial world, the capitalistic world, the marketplace, basically, that created the space and drew the people in the minds and addressed practical issues. And so what I really see myself now is doing is addressing practical issues. So as people go through, and this is not just me, but other people, as they go through a training simulation, as they select among products that they might buy in the store, as they watch different forms of media, how do their brains respond? As two people get together and talk, like in a speed dating scenario, how do their brains change? Now, we can approach this in a very sort of slow academic way and get very narrow with that and talk about it. We can also engage with it in a more fast-paced marketplace environment where the results really do matter still. There's just a different way of testing them. So, I mean, most of the stuff I do with brain imaging, in terms of the equipment that I'm using, the way I analyze the data, like that's all very stereotypical. I mean, there are things you can find on Wikipedia, like there are lots of researchers use EEG. There's several different network analysis techniques. I use one that is a little bit less popular, but there is a growing consensus that may actually be the better one to use. So that's in flux. And it's still used. So it's it's not controversial. The different functional contributions of different parts of the brain, I mean, those are all related to Brodmann areas that are already out there. So in many ways, I feel like what I'm doing is more correlative kind of research, correlative, rather than it is like, oh, like what exactly does this part of the brain do? I don't even say anything that isn't already published somewhere else in terms of like functional contribution. I haven't invented some new approach to analyzing the brain. I'm just doing correlative research. And I don't think we need to get really all academic about that. And that's where academia shines, by the way, when people really do need the time to develop something that's completely brand new in terms of technique or whatever it is. And to really then have the luxury of developing that sort of slowly and carefully. Whereas most of the results, like with the subtypes, purely came out of having a database, building that database, following a standardized protocol, with many of the activities taken from other people's protocols in the research. I mean, elements here and there. The Human Connectome project does something very similar, just uses fMRI instead of EEG. Gathering demographic data from people. And then as my interns started to, I mean, they asked for different projects to do. And as we started to look at it and break down people within the same type, and then sort the brains by career areas. So this is just demographic data. It's like, oh yeah, like they look different. There's like a background foreground phenomenon that ENFPs who go into science, technology, engineering, business, military, and yes, there are ENFPs who are scientists and engineers and so on. Like, let's get past the stereotypes. And then compare those brains to ENFPs who go into social service, the humanities, the arts, coaching and counseling, that we see that the networks that they emphasize in the brain change. And then we can simply look out and see, well, I mean, there are other people who've done research on how stable are these networks. So typically with EEG, the stability is 2 years. That's not me saying this, like this is out there in the literature. So it's just putting all the pieces together in a way that I think is practical for people, and then carrying type along with it, and it's like looking at type as a demographic variable and seeing that that's important, and that that's playing a role, and that now we can look at development, because I think if we want to talk about personality, we need to talk about development. That we can start talking about development in a concrete way. When I wrote these 64 descriptions, they're like, each one is like 1 page, for each of the 16 types, for the 4 subtypes within each one. Those are all based upon the demographic data and the neural network, like brain imaging analysis. And I felt very safe in doing that. I'm like, oh, this is all, it's not just me sitting there like, oh, I've met people of different types, like, what are they like? No, I mean, it's like actually just like grouping the reports together and seeing like, oh yes, all of these ESFPs, like, it's remarkable, the creative subtype of INFJ showing the starburst pattern of the brain. Time and time again, they are musicians, or they do music as a significant part of their life. Like, that's just a thing.
Yeah.
And that just, yeah.
Fantastic. You're building stuff on experimental research, you're going out, putting the cap and the electrodes on people's heads, and going out again and again and doing these and seeing the things that you're seeing. I know you mentioned that, having talked to, neuroscientists, like you said, that they don't see a lot controversial about, or anything controversial about what you're doing in terms of, the techniques you're using. Guess what academia doesn't accept Jungian psychological type that well in general in psychology, as far as I'm aware. I'm just interested, what hope might your research have in the future to help bring type back into more mainstream research? Is there any plans for like publishing papers in journals and that kind of thing that might help that sort of thing?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a tremendous amount of work to prepare a paper and publish it, in great part because brain imaging produces so much data, like gigabytes of data. And then the question becomes is like, what are good ways to organize that data and analyze that data? And really, there isn't one paper. There could easily be a half dozen papers. And the fact is that I mean, I'm not based in academia right now, and I do a lot of consulting work, and that simply takes up a lot of my time. COVID gave me the luxury in a way of stop gathering data so that I actually had time to do analysis. And now I have done a big chunk of analysis, but there's a really big second and actually probably third chunk of
Mm.
analysis that needs to happen. And with all of this data and the fact that it was gathered over 15 years. And so it really is just a tremendous amount of work. I mean, somebody wants to pay me to do it, I'd be more than happy to. And I have thought of the idea of having a Kickstarter or something like that that would essentially like raise the money so that yes, I could take a year off and basically, do the necessary research that's needed. But I actually really enjoy the work that I'm doing now. It really is this. I'm a strong believer. I'm not just a neuroscience researcher. Even though I'm not teaching formally in education, I do consider myself an educator. I mean, I won Teacher of the Year at UCLA, so I know how to educate. I'm aware of the issues, um, and I'm a strong believer in terms of where the future of education is going. I don't think the future of education is in universities. I mean, universities will always be there. They will continue to be there, but there's a reason why enrollment in universities, depending upon the university, has dropped anywhere from 5 to 20% in the last few years. And even after COVID has ended, it's continued to drop. I think some of it is that also companies are taking away requirements in terms of education, formal education, realizing that those are maybe not so important. The future of education is in portfolio building, in internships, in simulation-based learning, as well as, of course, some of the traditional lecture-based and so on, which I think will always be there. So for me, it's very exciting to contribute to working in simulation-based education, that people are learning about type by interacting with people of different types and making choices.
Mm.
And along the way, they're also dealing with the practical issues in which type is always embedded within a context of practical issues, both technical issues and interpersonal issues. And is really, and the idea of narrative-based learning, not just model-based learning, and then it's also experiential learning. So we're really reaching more people. I mean, if we think about like temperament, for example, the four temperaments, model-based learning, NTs, narrative-based learning, NFs, experiential-based learning, SPs. A lot of education is geared towards SJs, but I also think that they ultimately find it frustrating as well. Because then does it really meet the need that's in the real world? Yes, they memorized a lot of stuff, but what does it do from there? So I think like it's really exciting to me to be, um, building something that imagine in the future. Yes, I mean, because something we do is we actually put on caps, and I've done this with other companies, not just the one in Norway. There's another really great company, WTRI in San Diego, that does simulation-based learning. And we do brain imaging on people as they go through the simulations. And we do type assessment. And we don't have to use type in that case. Yes, we could use five-factor model or something like that. But at the end of the day, most companies are really interested in is like, what is practical? What's going to meet our needs? What do people have a positive response to? Five-factor model may be popular in academia. It has a horrible marketing problem, which I think will always be difficult to overcome. In fact, even somebody recently published who was quite pro factor admitted that actually it's probably its best use is in academia, and that it simply does not have the strengths that would be needed. Its strengths do not lie in reaching people, generally speaking. There's a reason why people don't put their 5-factor results in their, Facebook profile. Why there are not whole forums about it. Like it isn't. So to get back to your question is like, how can we move forward? Some of it is that I'm really busy and I both see the responsibility in what I'm doing to continue to do more and to publish on it. On the other hand, it's a little bit, I feel a little bit resentful, and it's like, oh, I should be doing the work of like 5 different people.
So
and
I could wave the magic wand and give Dario a lab and MRI machines and a load of staff to work for you and all the time and money. What would you do with it?
I don't think we even need something as fancy as that. I mean, fMRI is great because we could reach deeper into the brain. I think that would just build on the kind of research that I've already been doing. There are some people who have actually been publishing, and you're the one who sent the paper to me, so you know about it. The one where they basically use type, they just changed the names, but they even said we were inspired by type. I do think that going back to Jung is a particular strength. And now that there's the work by Mina Barmani, and Mina is actually, getting close to publishing papers, and more rests upon me to actually work back and forth with her. She's been waiting on me since February. I would need people to just actually be there to write up the results and to explain the process. Like it literally is, and is a fellow INTJ, you can probably relate that there's a certain point past which, although we can do a lot and our type has good follow through, the follow through to the very ending tends to be challenging. It's like when I'm flying over a new city that I'm arriving at and I can see it from the air, in my mind, I've already arrived, but technically I haven't arrived at the city until the plane has landed. And so there is that step. And it's probably reached a point, the research, where it's best done as a team. Unfortunately, the type community is, I don't want to say unfortunately, but it's really driven by 2 particular groups. And one of them is coaches, counselors, and therapists. And the other group is enthusiasts. And so to get teams of people working together, and there are in cases, some people who like individual companies, but then they hoard the research that they do. And that's, that's sort of unfortunate. But and there was a time when the Center for Application of Psychological Type really was trying to do the kind of work that we need to do. But I think, and I'll just say this because maybe somebody at CAPT wants to correct me. I'm open to being corrected, but they really seem more like a caretaker organization now, rather than something that's like really central in meeting the needs in the 21st century for doing research. And that's my opinion, my observation. But we need something like CAPT, but is like suited for the 21st century. I would say if I had the unlimited money, that's what probably I would do.
Type research institute of some kind.
Yes.
We had a question from someone who's saying, if they wanted to join in and get involved in this and learn how to use brain scanning equipment, without going off and doing a neuroscience degree, where could they start and become a independent researcher?
So, I would say there's a couple of ways to do it. One is that depending a little bit on the person's background, and there's actually some flexibility here with their existing degree, they could go do like a 3-day or 1-week training in neurotherapy. Well, they'll learn a lot about EEG and how it works and the functional parts of the brain and so on. It's not a degree, it's just a, certification. And then, they need to invest in the equipment or go work somewhere and do that. So there's somebody that I've been working with in France, my colleague Adrienne, And he already had a background in human resources, so running an outdoor adventure team building company. And he had read about my research and he wanted to do something with it. And he said, what can I do? So this is sort of like the question you're asking, this person coming to me. And his background was in human resources and he knew type. And he said, I'd like to do something with type, is what you're interested, is very interesting, but I want to bring in EEG. He had a goal, which is to bring it into organizations. And there is an interest in organizations to sort of say, like, the brain imaging report that you get, a personalized report, is like doing a personality questionnaire, except we're using brain imaging instead of self-reflection process or 360 process or whatever. And I said, well, here's the equipment options that are out there. He invested a couple $1,000 to get the equipment. I worked with him, in terms of understanding, what are the different functional regions. I have some white papers and so on. I just send them to people. Then we do a few like Zoom chats. He had the equipment, set it up, gathered the data. I'm like, let's set up a system where you send over the raw data and we'll generate reports. Now, bless his heart, he has ISFP preferences. And he said making these reports is really tedious. And he does happen to have a programming background, is in addition to HR. So we just created a whole website where you can just upload the data and it automatically generates the report. So like the folks who came to London in July, to Adrian and I working there, they got their results right away because he had the very practical hat on. And it's great. I mean, the equipment is even better than what I've been using in the past. 50% more sensors, wireless, all of this stuff. And now, then he can, with the website and sample reports, and he did some research on what is the market willing to bear in France and in the EU in general, and began a business. Now, along the way, he's been doing some research, including some really cool things. And we've been doing some research together. And looking, for example, when people, right now what we do, the protocol is like 30 or 40 minutes of like 10, 12 different activities to stimulate the brain in different ways. But what he said is like, why don't we try this? Not instead of, but in addition to, for people who want something in more detail, that they're going to do 4 or 5 different activities that are quite specific, each of them for 10 to 15 minutes. And 12 minutes is a very standard duration in EEG. So let's just do like 12 minutes in each one. 12 minutes of playing a competitive board game, 12 minutes of playing the piano, 12 minutes of doing computer programming, whatever it is the person selects, meditation, which allows, that time allows the brain, because the brain can shift gears after 10 minutes of some sustained activity. It's one thing to say, oh, yes, meditate for the next 2 minutes. It's another to have a person meditate for 12 minutes. Like neurologically, they're different from each other. There's a certain on-ramp period that tends to be around 10 minutes in order for the limbic system to change and for our window of focus to change, to really change. And then to compare and to show the person the comparisons. Look how your brain was different when you did this analytical activity compared to the 4 other activities that you did. Look how your brain was different when you did meditation indoors versus outdoors.
Yeah.
And answering some, like, so in that sense, like doing some research, very basic, not organized research yet, just exploratory pilot kind of stuff. And so that was his particular interest. Then somebody else contacted me from Florida, who was part of the type community, ENTP preferences, and he said, how can I get involved? And bought the same equipment, went through the same process of helping him out. He's had some work issues that have prevented him from like launching his own business with it. But and I think somebody in academia can do the same, because equipment and so on, the techniques, all of that is not controversial. They can very easily do a master's degree reporting that they use this equipment, and they have these references, that they're using this analytical technique in order to evaluate it. Like, the person wants to do a master's degree with EEG, like, just call me. I'm not going to provide it for free. I mean, it does take a little, or get in line, one of the two if you want it for free. But I'm happy to help people out, and it very easily can be done. I think the challenge is, as you said, is not the neuroscience part of it. It's like, why select MBTI as an instrument and type as a framework? And then, if the person is in academia, then they need to convince their advisor to at least do 2 different assessments. Yes, we'll use 5-factor and we'll also use this other one. But then they can also point to some things, unfortunately, it's going to take a couple more years for those papers to be out to like really support it, because that's, I think first with Mina Barmani's work, really demonstrating that Jung's 8 functions are these legitimate distinct categories of mental processing in the standard psychometric sense. And then for me, more to get the research out there, because it's very multifaceted, the data that comes out. The brain is very multidimensional. It's not just like if we read a paper, and there are in Journal of Analytical Psychology, they published a few things that are on the brain activity and type. There's the analysis is so old school. It's not wrong, it's not bad, but it's like we're just going to analyze it in this one way that they used to analyze it in 1979, which is still legitimate, but like misses so much. And I'm like, why? Like, so in order to get it type is personality is very multidimensional. This idea of creative flow, for example, that people get into creative flow in different ways. That some people of each type, some ENFPs are more creative than other ENFPs.
Should we talk about this? I'm interested in getting into the subtypes on that note. Is it worth sharing your slides briefly? Maybe spending like 10, 15 minutes, have a slightly extended one today, and covering that subtypes, because it's so fascinating. I'd love to see a little bit.
Sure. Yeah. I can just sort of like, without getting into all the detail of it, I can
an overview.
Yeah. So should I do the share screen?
Yes. If you should be able to.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
So this here is like, this is one kind of data that I work with, which is the network. So you think of like social networks, the brain has networks, and there are different kinds of networks. There are ones that have people with front biases and back biases. There's the starburst patterns and there are diamond patterns. I made up these terms in large part just to describe what it is I'm seeing, so that there's like a taxonomy of networks for the average person to understand. Like, yes, back bias, that's like easy to understand what that is. Then, and yes, there are some people who have more, left brain bias or left hemisphere bias or right hemisphere bias, but still all of us use all of our brains in some way. And what's interesting is how the regions connect. This is very different, by the way, than what I talked about or what I focused on in my 2011 book, Neuroscience of Personality, where I just use standard, very old school, like, oh, which brain regions are more or less active. And there's nothing wrong with that, but definitely the trend in the past 10 years, I mean, since like 2005, 2006, in the past 10 years for sure, has been looking at networks. And so I'm looking at all these different networks. And so one thing I did is I had this intern with ENFP preferences, and she's like, I'd like to do something for my project. Like, what can I do? And I said, well, why don't we just take all of the ENFP network data? Because that ENFP we had the most number of types. But she said they're gathered with sometimes with different equipment. So she's like, well, let me use the equipment that's like has the 20 sensors. And we had 17 people with the 20 sensor EEG who are ENFPs. And she sorted them in different ways demographically. So we see one group of people on the left, 9 people who were all had majors or degrees or were working in business and science of some kind. And then we had another group of people, another group of ENFPs, 8 of them, who were like coaches and counselors or artists or something like that. There's a lot of, I would say the male ENFP artist, especially if they're in the digital arts, is quite a common thing, at least in my database. So there's these 2 groups. And what we see is that right away, we get this feeling, oh, they're very different. And then, oh, they're actually like, is ENFP a real thing then? Well, yes, because as we look at them more closely, we see, for example, on the right, there's the strong black starburst pattern that's there, which is just a stylized way of saying all the regions firing at once. And then if we look on the left, we actually see that pattern, but it's in gray rather than black, which means it's there, but it's in the background. So this creative starburst flow pattern is in the foreground for the ENFPs, who are the soft sciences and the arts and so on, humanities, and then it's something that's in the background for people in the sciences and in business. And ENFP is still the type that's most likely to have the starburst pattern of any type, even regardless of this. And then as we look at some of the other patterns that are here, which there are 2 or 3 other things I could point out, there's this background foreground effect. And so we noticed this as we began to look at different types, and we thought, well, maybe we can put them into like 4 groups. You know, we don't have to divide just into 2. We can, you know, sort them into 4 categories, or even with ENFP, like 8 categories, because now we have 65 ENFPs. So, and this was a task for me to take 65 ENFPs with brain imaging data gathered from mostly 3 different instruments, like actual pieces of equipment, and then find a way to blend all of their results so that we can see them all simultaneously. And so this is, it's like, you know, it's like an analysis process, but I have to build the software and the technique in order to combine data from different instruments and to like condense it down into visual networks.
Yeah.
And so that's why it took time just to take like this one slice. And so eventually, yes, we did it, and we focused on 4 different groups, 4 variants. And there are more than 4 brain patterns, but when you look at the demographic data and also looking at what was out there, Dr. Helen Fisher work, Dr. Victor Galenko's work, Dr. Helen Fisher does stuff that's on neurotransmitters and hormones, and her work is, you know, very scientific and respected. And I saw these just really profound correlations, even with groups of 4. That there is this dominant version of ENFP, that it tends to be in certain professions, has more of a leader role in organizations. We can say is more, you know, I haven't correlated it with neurotransmitters and hormones because that's not my research area and I don't have equipment to do that. But looking at Dr. Helen Fisher's work and seeing the correlations, I mean, yes, we can see more confident and driven. These are people who have front brain bias. And they are then, we know just even from the 5-factor data, like people who have more front brain bias are more extroverted and are more confident. And that's just like, there's a certain things that just stand out. People in the creative category are more likely to have the starburst pattern, far more likely. And they're far more likely to be in creative professions. I mean, like the obviously creative profession, you know, like a musician or artist or performance art, or you know, whatever kind of art it is, travel, these kinds of things. They were more likely to have actually, because people could indicate more than one professional area that they work in, they were more likely to have multiple professional areas that they worked in. Just like people ask me, what do I do? I'm like, well, that's a really hard question to answer, because I'm not just neuroscience researcher. I mean, I also have music on iTunes, and I publish fiction, and I do nonfiction stuff, and it's with type, yes. But I also do a whole course that's on yoga. Like, you know, there's different things. So that's like, I am the creative subtype, by the way, of INTJ. Many INTJs are the normalizing subtype, which is quite different than me. I mean, fundamentally, we still both score on the MBTI as INTJ. We both are like, yes, we're INTJ. But then when you dig, you see like there are developmental differences. There are brain wiring differences. There are demographic differences. There are probably hormonal differences. I say probably because Helen Fisher hasn't worked with type, but because of the way things lined up, I'm guessing these are the kinds of things we would see. So in that multi-million-dollar lab, like we would definitely work with neurotransmitters and hormones. So it's really nice to be able to sort of dig into this and go on this journey and really come to appreciate, for example, that my grandmother wasn't just ESTJ preferences. She was a creative subtype of ESTJ, which, and there is, excuse me, there is, not all ESTJs are like managers in large organizations. Like this is just really something that I think is really important to understand. In fact, I think a big takeaway from the 64 as people read through it, they're like, wow, like the sensing folks have a lot more variety than I thought. Yeah, of course they do. You know, so there's this huge bias in the type community that of people, I mean, just intuiting types are highly represented in the type community, especially the professional type community, the interest in type. There's a fair amount of stereotyping, some of it quite negative around certain types, people sensing preference. And I'm like, you know, there's versions, there's developmental versions of every type, and you might be surprised that in fact somebody who even thought that they were intuiting type is actually has sensing preference, but they just happen to be like the creative sensing or harmonizing persons like thinking but harmonizing. So I think in terms of like busting stereotypes, reaching more people in the population, helping people get a best fit type, I mean, those are all practical things, and if that is working or isn't working, and to be able to point back to the data. And then the really cool thing is the people who've been working in academia in personality, who've been using 5-factor model, we're thinking for a long time that these traits were stable. That over, yes, when you would test people or give, because that they use the word test, but you know, when they assess people with 5-factor model between, you know, like age 25 and age 30, they see, oh yes, these traits over 5 years are quite stable. But then it turns out over the course of a lifetime that the traits are not stable. That person when they were 15 and the person when they're 75 actually comes across as a different person. And type is already, when it's used smartly, is already a developmental model. So this, I feel like this is a great way for us to get to development. Because the brain, it's based on brain imaging data, and we know that the brain is flexible and it changes, which means that people can change, which means that we begin to take type in a developmental direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's curious, you know, a lot of the sort of mainstream trait research, it's what they call between person, you know, and what we're interested in is like within person, like what's happening in the dynamics within the person, right? In the in a process functional sense, and then within a lifetime, right? Over development.
Yeah. I did do one thing which I think I've only presented to British APT, which is, and this was, I guess, in April, was what are some of those developmental differences sort of worldwide between different cultures and across a lifespan? So I have taken the data for INTJs and really broken it down quite a bit. And we see this amazing statistical pattern that runs over the course of a lifetime. Now, there's only 45 INTJs in the group, but in neuroscience, 45 is considered a pretty decent group of people. Especially when they're all treating, you know, you just divide in half or something. It's like, yeah, you still have 2 groups. But to see this pattern over time, that really is, you know, like age groups and how there are similarities and differences. So like, yes, many young INTJs are in STEM, you know, science, technology, education. And then in their, after 25 through 45, you see a tremendous amount of diversification. That, you know, the 35-year-old INTJ is often really showing their intuiting preference in a way that's beyond just like this focus on one particular interest. They tend to be very diverse. And then you look at them again in the 45 to 65, and you can see that they've begun to specialize in an area that captures a lot of that diversity, but has also been some pruning that's going on. And then after 65, we begin to see a return to not the science and technology focus, but to like a purely intuiting kind of focus again, that shows actually the highest incidence of being capacity for being in flow is actually the 65 and over INTJs. And so it's like, yeah, imagine if we had type descriptions where you could like click on which of like 4 cohorts you're in, or you could just like, sort of like you move the pointer and you're like, how does my type change over time? So that's one of my goals. And that to me is far more interesting than, to be honest, than like writing a bunch of detailed academic papers. And it just takes a tremendous amount of work. Like it took quite a bit of work to do just INTJ. And then to do that for 15 more types. Gosh, if we only had a theory with fewer types, it would be easier. But Enneagram only has 9 types. But it will take quite a bit of research. But that to me is like a dream, is for people to be able to sort of drag their cursor over the, the age and see, like, how does my type tend to change in terms of demographics, in terms of interest, in terms of brain wiring, over the course of a lifespan.
Nice.
And I think that would do, does that bring buy-in from academia? Probably not in some ways, because I think academia fundamentally, Jung is very well known. Carl Jung, I mean, he's a revered person in the history of psychology. Academics today don't really care about Jung. I mean, they're more obsessed with Freud for some reason, even though his ideas are really quite simplistic. And then a lot of academia has actually just rejected Freud completely and then moved on to a very behavioralist way of thinking. I also think we should be careful in looking at America as a standard bearer for how we do research or how we think of application. I think we do need to be careful. The US has a long tradition of confusing measurement with empiricism. That measurement, only things that are measurable are worthwhile. Only things that can be published in an academic journal out of the New England Journal of such and such are worthwhile. And so I think that by doing this kind of research, to be able to point back to, oh yes, there's this body of neuroscience research, and that we're writing these descriptions based upon a rigorous process. And so I would say for all the people listening who aren't doing neuroscience, but they're still interested in doing type research and they want buy-in, I'm like, have a standardized process that is objective in some way. Like, do interviews with people, record the interviews. It's very easy today, like audio recordings, it's very easy today to take the interview and have it transcribed into paper, like literally 5 minutes. There's like a website, there's an app for that. Okay. And assuming the person spoke clearly, 95% of their words are going to come across. You then use another app that does like word frequency analysis and concept frequency analysis. The concept one is a little bit more difficult to get at, but there is software for that. And it's like all of a sudden you can begin to describe the types. You did these interviews and you followed a completely like scientific sort of objectified process. Follow a process and produce something. It's fun to talk about type, but I think that will get respect from so many quarters when you just describe your process. It's like somebody came along, he's like, I mean, he didn't know anything about MBTI, but I mean, he's pro-type, this person is talking to, but he doesn't know anything about MBTI. And he's like, there isn't really any type research out there. Like, this is like, there's just this instrument. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, there's a whole, there's the Milo database with like thousands of like articles and research. He's like, well, they've never done panels with type, where you have like 3 people sitting on a panel who are type experts and they independently try and determine the person's type. And I'm like, yes, there is. And in fact, it was on British television. Yeah. And there was like a whole process that demonstrated that. Like, if you can just show that, it doesn't have to pass through every single hoop in order to get credibility. There really are ways of approaching type and using type that if an organization can even say, hey, after we use type, we introduce into the organization, we use it in certain ways, we found retention and employee satisfaction improved. There's nothing wrong with that research. Like, that's great. Like, do that. Like, whatever it is that is your interest and you have access to. So I see it as like, we also need to remember we're in type for the long haul, and that, there's still another 78 years of the 21st century. Yeah. And there's a lot to do. I'm only one person and I'm working with a few other people, but right now my focus happens to be just professionally, you know, I'm working for a client basically full. I mean, the client hired me full time 6 months a year, so I'm pretty much like tied up with that. But I believe in a way, imagine the time will come, which is not too far away, where people can play a simulation and they will interact with people of different types. And then they'll really experience, oh, this is what it's like. And that to me is like, as long as you capture the public imagination and you have an objective process that you followed and you can explain what it is that you're doing, and we continue to defend, you know, because there's a lot of statements made against the MBTI that are just like simply false or like so grossly outdated. Like they refer to a version of the MBTI that hasn't been in use for 30 years. I mean, those people just need to be put in their place, frankly.
I would love to carry on there. It'd be so good to carry on. I think I'm going to have to wrap up today's interview because of the time. We've gone a bit over quite a bit over the normal time that we do. It just really wanted to get in that about the subtypes. Maybe we should have another follow-up sometime. You know, do a third conversation. That would be really fantastic. And just get more into the subtypes. I know there's bits we didn't cover on it. So yeah, I'd just love to thank you for today. You know, so much knowledge and information, and you know, you've been doing so much work. Like you said, there's only one of you, and it's incredible what you've managed to produce. You know, in your books and your research. So it'd be exciting to see what comes next. You know.
I do want people to know that if they visit radiancehouse.com, there's a link that takes them to like an ebook download site. And there are things there which are free, as well as things which are very cheap, you know, like £3, £4, as well as I said, stuff that's free and they can read right away. So if they want to know more about the subtypes, there is the equivalent of a 200-page book that's there. With all of the descriptions and so on. And then there's some things like on the cognitive processes assessment, the work with Mina Barmani. There's a white paper that's downloadable for free. There's quite a bit of a resource at radiancehouse.com, and then just follow the link that's at the top to the ebook store.
Thank you. Yeah, great resources. Do go out and read Dario's materials to find out more. And we will have him back again for another interview, and we'll hopefully see you at the conference in April as well, I would hope.
Yeah, I hope so. It will probably be, I mean, barring another surprise with COVID or something like that, then or war, heaven forbid, I'll be working in Europe, so I will pop right over the channel, not the pond, but the channel, and yeah, and say hello. Yeah, I'm really hoping we can do an in-person one again. I mean, it's very nice to have the conferences by Zoom, but yeah.
Well, we do have a little one planned. I'll let you know more about that, and you know, maybe you could even pop over for that. And anyway, it'd be great to see you. Take care. Thanks again for coming along.
Absolutely. And for Carmine, just reach out to me at my email address, like at servants@radiancehouse.com, and we can talk further. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Yeah, absolutely. Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.